If you're looking for an apartment in New York City, you will inevitably come across the building type that makes up the majority of the New York City residential real estate, and that is called a co-op. What is up, everyone? My name is Sargis. I'm a licensed real estate agent based here in New York City. My goal for this channel is to be a resource for you and provide you as much information as I can about New York City real estate. In this video, we'll discuss everything you need to know about buying a co-op apartment in New York City. What is a co-op? What are the steps in a co-op buying process? Pros and cons of owning a co-op? And what are some important questions that you need to be asking when looking for a co-op apartment? At the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to expect from a co-op apartment and whether or not you should even consider buying a co-op. Now let's take a step back here for a moment. New York City residential real estate consists of townhouses, condominiums that are also known as condos, cooperative corporations that are also known as co-ops, and condos, which is a hybrid that includes both condominium and cooperative ownership structure. Our primary focus today will be co-ops. Now, what is the difference between condo and a co-op? Both of them can be a large building that has a few hundred apartments, or both of them can be a small building that has 10 or less apartments. The difference between condo and a co-op is a type of ownership. When you buy an apartment in a condominium, you are buying a real property. It is the same as if you would buy a house or a land anywhere in the country. You'll receive a deed and you own that particular apartment and a percentage of the common areas such as lobby, hallways, elevators, gym, rooftop. You'll also have a title to your property. So the question is, what do you own if you buy an apartment in a co-op building? Co-op is a cooperative corporation that owns the entire multi-unit building. In other words, the real property is the whole building. Every unit in the building has a specific number of shares allocated to it, just like if you're looking at a traditional stock market. Shares represent portions of the stock in a corporation. The amount of shares for each apartment is determined when a co-op is first built or when it was first converted. Mostly it depends how large is your apartment. Let's look at the example here. For the simplicity, let's say we have an 8-unit building, which means there are total 8 apartments in this co-op building. One 4-bedroom apartment that has 800 shares, one 3-bedroom apartment that has 600 shares, 3 2-bedroom apartments 400 shares each, and 3 1-bedroom apartments 200 shares each. Total, there are 3,200 shares in this corporation. So two things here. Number of shares in real life most likely are not going to be this simple, and shares can be the same for 2 apartments if they have the exact same floor plan. But if, let's say, A-line apartments have balconies or additional walk-in closet, this means that the shares for A-line 1-bedrooms will be more than the shares for B-line 1-bedrooms. But for the simplicity, let's go back to our example. Let's say you're looking for a 3-bedroom apartment. You find the apartment you like and you would like to buy it from the person selling it. If this was a condo, you would own that 3-bedroom apartment individually as a real property, as well as the percentage of all of the common areas of the building. You would receive a deed and a title when you purchase the property. But if the building is a co-op and you're buying this 3-bedroom apartment, this means that the seller is selling his or her shares of stock in the ownership of the entire building, which means that you are buying those 600 shares of this total 3,200 share corporation. Instead of the deed, you'll receive what's called a stock certificate that certifies your ownership of those 600 shares in this corporation. Okay, so now you own those shares. But who said you're allowed to live in that 3-bedroom apartment? In order for you to live there, you're also going to be given what's called a proprietary lease. This allows you to occupy a specific unit in that co-op building. The proprietary lease is different than a typical rental agreement because this allows you to occupy your apartment in perpetuity as long as you own those shares. This document is very important. It is the agreement between you and the corporation, and it governs the relationship between you as a shareholder and the corporation. Another important thing to understand here are the fees associated with carrying the apartment. Since the co-op apartments are not considered as a real property, when you buy a cooperative apartment, you won't have a separate property tax bill. Instead, you'll pay what's called a monthly maintenance. Condominium often refers to this monthly payment as HOA fees. In New York City, it's called a common charges. Those essentially mean the same thing, it's just you'll hear the term common charges in New York City. In a co-op, monthly maintenance fees include costs of maintaining and operating the building, the maintenance of the common areas such as the hallways, elevators, laundry room, gym, kids playroom, rooftop, depends how big is your building and what are the amenities that the building offers. It can also cover the staff salary such as the doorman, porters, super, and management company fees. In some co-ops, even the utilities such as electric, heat, and hot water are included in your maintenance bill. But most of the time, expect to pay your utilities separate. The difference between cooperative maintenance fees and condo common charges is that co-op maintenance also includes your property taxes. So when you own a co-op apartment, you'll have only one bill that includes everything. But if you own a condo, you'll have your common charges bill and your property taxes bill separate. How much your monthly maintenance fees are depends on how many shares you own in the co-op. Each year, the board of the co-op building creates a projected budget for all of the building's costs for that year. All of those maintenance and operating costs plus costs of the real estate taxes for the whole building are added together, then divided by total number of shares the cooperative corporation has. Each share is allocated a dollar amount. To get each apartment's maintenance costs, the number of shares the apartment has is multiplied by the projected costs of each share for that year. Now let's go back to our imaginary 8-unit co-op building as an example. In order to operate properly, the building has maintenance and operation costs. The board of directors adds all the costs of those plus the real estate taxes for the whole building. And let's say as an example, this building needs $192,000 per year to operate properly. Remember, we have total 3,200 shares, which means the maintenance would be $60 per share. So if you own this 3-bedroom apartment that has 600 shares, your portion of the maintenance would be $36,000 per year, which means you are responsible paying $3,000 per month maintenance. The same way is calculated for all other apartments. So the more shares your apartment has, the higher your monthly maintenance fees will be. Just to be clear, the maintenance has nothing to do with your mortgage. This is just how much it will cost you to carry the apartment every single month if you don't have a mortgage payment. This is just an oversimplified example, but this will give you a good understanding on how the maintenance works. The more amenities the building has, the higher will be the operating costs. So what is a cooperative board? A co-op is run by a board of directors. The members of the board are people who own shares in the co-op, and therefore they have a common interest in making sure that the building is protected and properly maintained. The cooperative board typically has an odd number of members, and depending how big is the building, usually contains a president, vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. They have a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interest of the building. And one of the important things to consider when buying a co-op versus a condo or a house is you have to be approved by the board of directors in order to buy an apartment in the building. This is just an extra step that co-op buyers have to go through. We'll discuss the approval part in details later in the video. Let's talk about the steps it takes to buy a co-op apartment. Now that you know what a co-op is, after looking what's available on the market, you found an apartment that you like, and it's time to make an offer. When I say you, I mean you and your real estate agent. Buying an apartment in New York City is not a DIY project. The transactions can be very complicated, especially if you're buying a co-op apartment. It is important to work with a competent agent that has successfully closed a lot of transactions and knows what exactly to look for in order to properly guide you through the process. If your agent doesn't know the co-op structure or is not familiar with the requirements or doesn't know how to find the important requirements that is specific to your case, this can result in delays, frustrations, and in the worst case, your rejection in buying a home in that co-op building, which means you have to start the process all over again. Later, when we put all the puzzle pieces together, you'll see why it is important to have a pro agent to help you through this process. We will not talk about how to find an apartment, make an offer, and the negotiation process here in this video. I just don't want to make 2-hour-long video. Instead, We'll keep the focus on the co-op specific things in this video, but those are important skills that you should be looking for in your agent. How well they can deliver your offer to the seller's agent and how well they can negotiate on your behalf. In this stage of the process, your agent can save you tens and thousands of dollars or even hundreds and thousands of dollars depending on the market and the price point you're looking to buy. So fast forward through making an offer, negotiating with a seller, and now you have an accepted offer. It's time to deal with a purchase contract. From the moment you have an accepted offer, the attorneys will take over. In New York City, contract negotiations are handled by attorneys. In some states, the contracts can be handled by the agents and escrow companies, but in New York City, it is typical and recommended that you have a real estate attorney to represent you in the transaction. And you'll see why soon. The process is the following. The seller's attorney prepares the contract and sends it to the buyer's attorney for review. At the same time, buyer's attorney will start the due diligence on the building. Due diligence consists of the following elements: reviewing the co-op's offering plan, reviewing the building's financials, reading the co-op board's past 1 or 2 years of meeting minutes, and submitting an extensive questionnaire to the building's management. Your attorney will know exactly what to look for, and before you sign the contract, your attorney will give you a detailed summary of the building and the risks associated with purchasing the shares allocated to that specific apartment in this co-op. Now you're probably asking,
but what are all of those?
I'll just talk about this briefly. The building's offering plan is a book that is usually a few hundred pages long, and it describes in detail every single aspect of the property being sold for the first time. The building's financials will show what cash reserves are available if the building has an emergency repairs or for future capital improvement projects. It will show if the building is operating at a deficit, meaning does the monthly income cover the monthly expenses of the building, or at a surplus, maybe they're charging too much maintenance. The minutes tell the story of the inner workings of the building. They also describe what capital improvements they're planning and the cost that you might be liable for. Also, any shareholder complaints, reports on damages, repairs, approvals and disapprovals of purchase requests or sublet requests. An experienced attorney knows how to read between the lines and extract valuable information about how the building operates and what your expenses and liabilities might be if you buy a home in this co-op building. After a thorough review of all of the available documents, they may have additional questions and might submit a questionnaire to the managing agent to find out the answers before reporting back to you. Mostly, they're looking for any potential red flags, things that are out of ordinary, or potential costs that might be a burden on you in the future. During the due diligence process, the attorneys are also simultaneously negotiating your offer and finalizing them in the contract of sale. And during this period is when you get to do the formal inspection of the apartment and the building. An inspection is very important when you're buying a house, but when it comes to an inspection of the co-op unit, here's the thing. The corporation itself is responsible for the big ticket items, such as the foundation, roof, plumbing, electric, and anything inside the walls. You are only responsible for your portion of those expenses, depending on how many shares your apartment has. If you're buying a house, you are 100% responsible for these items, and no one else will share the costs of these expenses. In the situation when you're buying an apartment in a large co-op building that has a professional management company, most likely they're not going to allow any inspection in the boiler room, mechanicals, elevators, or compactor room. However, the seller will almost always allow you to inspect inside the apartment. When it comes to the question whether or not you should do an inspection when buying a co-op unit, I always recommend hiring a professional inspector to inspect the unit. Even though co-op is responsible for those big ticket items, there are things that the inspector will look for inside the unit. And if everything is perfect inside the unit, well, congratulations. You just found the ideal apartment and that money is very well spent. But most of the time, there are always something that the inspection will discover. Issues with appliances such as stove or refrigerator, ventilation or electrical problems, or damaged floors, cracked tiles in the kitchen and bathroom. You name it. There can be a second round of negotiations with sellers asking for those items to be repaired before closing or for money back to make those repairs. But be careful when negotiating for these types of concessions. Always talk to your agent. Hopefully they have enough experience and knowledge to direct the negotiations in the right way. You certainly don't want to overpay, but don't lose the home of your dreams over some small cosmetic repairs. Negotiations for inspection issues largely depend on how competitive the market you're buying in is and the terms of your original offer being accepted. Were there multiple offers and bidding war that you won, or the apartment has been on the market for a few months now and your offer was the only serious offer they had? This is another situation where your agent's knowledge and skills can potentially save you a lot of money and make sure you won't miss out on your perfect home. The contract negotiations take about 1 to 2 weeks, and the contract will specify all the terms of the transaction. The contract will also specify the work that the seller needs to do to fix any problems discovered by the inspection, if you were able to successfully negotiate those repairs into the contract. By the end of second week, you should have everything ready, and now it's time to sign the contract. You, the buyer, will sign the contract first and submit a good faith deposit. This deposit is also called an earnest money deposit, which in New York City is typically 10% of the purchase price, to demonstrate a good faith and your seriousness and willingness to complete the transaction. This money is deposited to seller's attorney's escrow account, and this will go towards your down payment. Once you sign the contract and send the deposit, the seller's attorney will send the contract to the seller for review and countersignature. And once the seller countersigns the contract, now you can breathe a little bit. Congratulations, you are officially in contract, and at this point in time, nobody else can purchase the apartment. It is important to note that at any time during these negotiations that is happening between an accepted offer and the contract signing, until both parties have signed the contract and the escrow is deposited, neither party is obligated to complete the sales transaction. Once you have a signed contract, we can go to the next step. Now you're going to work on two things. The first one is your board application, which your agent should start as soon as you have a signed contract. A co-op board package, also known as purchase application, is one of the most important part in buying a co-op. This is another reason that you need to be working with an agent who has an experience in submitting a co-op board packages. Doing this incorrectly can cause a lot of delays, and in worst case, you will be rejected. The second thing is your loan process if you're financing. Once you have a signed contract, this is the time when the bank will order an appraisal. The last piece of information that you will need to submit with your board package is a letter from a bank called a commitment letter. Obviously, if you're purchasing all cash, there is no loan or appraisal involved. You can just work on your board package. Now, let's talk the details of the board application. Each co-op is a privately owned corporation, so the policies and the requirements can vary. The purpose of this application is for co-op to make sure that you meet all the financial requirements and you are a qualified buyer to carry this apartment without any financial problems in the future. Just because you won a lottery and now you have $1 million in your bank account doesn't mean that you can go ahead and buy a co-op apartment that costs $1 million. Co-ops will thoroughly investigate your finances. In this package, they typically would want to see your financial statements detailing your income, assets, and liabilities, together with substantiating documents, including your pay stubs, bank statements for all accounts, last 2 years of tax returns, W-2 forms, personal and professional reference letters, a commitment letter, and other bank-related documents if you're financing. This is where you would submit checks to pay any closing costs associated with the building. Keep in mind that there are going to be a few documents in this board package that needs to be signed by the seller, and depending on the building, the seller might have a few checks to submit as well. During this process, your agent needs to be in touch with the seller's agent to make sure that they're doing their part as well. After the board reviews your application, you either will receive an interview request, which hopefully you do, or they might ask some additional documents depending on your specific situation, or they will just reject your application. Why? Because they can. At the time of recording this, in New York City, co-op boards don't have to disclose the reason for your rejection. And again, we're coming back to the most important thing, which is having an experienced agent who first of all reviews all the requirements to make sure that your financials meet all the co-op's requirements in the first place before even submitting an offer. We'll talk about the requirements a little bit later. And if you do satisfy the requirements, your application has to be put together in a correct way. You might experience a significant delay if your application is incorrect or there are missing documents or checks. Now, assuming everything was done correctly and you have received an interview invitation. This is not a typical job interview where you are trying to impress your employer with your skills. In a nutshell, this just means that everything in your board package looks good to them and they just want to see you to make sure that you are who you claim to be in your application and you won't cause any inconveniences to your neighbors. Typically, you just need to be concise and honest with your answers and know what exactly is written in your board application, especially your finances. Don't digress from subject or question and start providing them additional information about everything that you're great at, all your achievements and other information they didn't ask you. Depending on the building, the interview can be with one person or it can be with multiple board members. Present yourself as a good neighbor and an asset to the building. Hopefully your agent will prepare you for this interview. For people that are coming out of state and not familiar with co-ops, this might sound a little overwhelming that you have to provide so much information about your finances and go through an interview. But this is a normal procedure. New York is a big city where the cost of living is one of the highest in the country, and co-ops may be an attractive option from financial perspective for people that come here from all over the world, since co-ops are cheaper to purchase and maintain compared to the same type of apartment in a condo. This is done to avoid any financial problems in the future with people not paying their maintenance or mortgage and to protect everyone's investments in the building. Now, assuming the interview went well and you are approved by the board of directors. Great, but we're not done yet. The next and final step is closing. Your closing typically will be scheduled within a week or two after receiving a board approval, and if you're financing, you will also need to be cleared to close by the bank. Once your closing date is scheduled, the day before your closing or the same morning, you'll do the final walkthrough of the apartment to make sure that nothing has changed since you made an offer. There was no flood, fire, or any other damage to the apartment. And to make sure that all the work that the seller was supposed to do according to the contract is done before the closing. Everyone gets their checks and you get the keys to your apartment. Congratulations, you are officially a homeowner. For those of you who are still here with me, I know this was a lot of information to take at once, but bear with me. There are a few more important things that we need to talk about. Next, let's talk about co-op specific rules and requirements. The important thing here to understand is for one person, some or all of those rules and requirements can be an advantage, and for others, these can be a disadvantage. It all depends on your current situation, why you're buying, your timeline, and your future goals. And your agent plays a huge role, first understanding your needs, then finding the right building for you. Here are the most common co-op requirements. Financing requirement. Co-ops have caps on maximum percentage you can finance when buying in the building. The common down payment requirement is anywhere between 20 to 30%. 20 is mostly what you'll see. Very few co-op buildings might allow 10% down payment, but I haven't seen anything lower than that. But I have seen buildings that require as much as 50% down payment. The next thing is what's called a post-closing reserves. Co-ops usually requires buyers to have at least 2 years worth of maintenance and mortgage payment in their bank account after closing. For example, if you're going to have $2,000 a month mortgage payments and the maintenance for this apartment is $1,000 a month, you'll need to have about $72,000 sitting in your bank account after you've paid your down payment and your closing costs. 2 years post-closing liquidity requirement is the most common one, but depending on the co-op, if they're not too strict about this, you might be approved if you have a little bit less than that. Next, Co-ops usually have certain DTI requirements. Some of the buildings might even give you in writing what your total debt must be. If the requirement is under 30%, it doesn't matter if the bank approves you for a loan with 38% DTI. 25% and under is typically what's considered to be safe, but again, it all depends on the building and how strict they are. Next one is sublet policy. Co-ops usually have rules when it comes to subletting your apartment when you decide you no longer want to live there. The most common sublet policy I see is you're able to sublet your apartment every 2 out of 4 or 5 years. In this case, after renting your apartment for 2 years, you either have to come back and live in your apartment or keep it vacant for another 2 or 3 years before you can rent it again. Other common sublet policies I have seen are certain number of years during the life of your ownership with or without any prior occupancy, or just simply no sublet at all. Other requirements can be co-purchases, gifts, guarantors, parents, and pied-à-terre. All or some of these can be allowed or not allowed depending on the building. Everything is pretty much self-explanatory. Just pied-à-terre means that the apartment is not the shareholder's primary residence. So if you're coming to New York City a few times a year and you prefer to buy an apartment to stay there instead of going to the hotels, make sure that you are looking in the buildings where pied-à-terre is allowed. So the next big question is, what are the pros and cons of owning a co-op? The first pro would be that the co-ops are way more affordable. Why? Because in New York City, there are a lot more co-ops than condos, which means you have a lot of choices when it comes to buying a co-op. The second pro would be that the closing costs are significantly less compared to the similar condo. Since co-op apartments are not considered as a real property, there is no mortgage recording tax. The third pro would be there is much more stability and you have a community in a co-op. Think about it this way: if you have to go through this long and thorough financial review process, that means that your neighbors went through that process as well. This means that they all have strong financials and they'll maintain the building in a proper condition. Now let's talk about the cons of the co-op. Financial requirements such as down payment, DTI ratio, and post-closing liquidity. The other con would be that the co-op board can reject your application without providing the reason. Sublet policy can be strict. Closing takes longer because of the extra step of board approval. The other con is co-op is an older type of ownership compared to condominium. Therefore, co-ops are mostly older buildings without any fancy technology. It is important to understand that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and pros and cons depend on your specific situation. For one person, a pro we've mentioned before can be a disadvantage, and for other person, one or all of the cons we've mentioned before can be an advantage. I'll explain what I mean, but just know that always talk to a professional who will guide you and help you find the right building for you. Let's say you have a stable job, excellent credit, and you've saved enough money to buy an apartment. Well, in this case, those strict financial requirements such as down payment, DTI, and post-closing liquidity can be to your advantage. If you're competing with other offers and your financial situation is better, well, the chances are high that your offer will be accepted, because the last thing that the seller wants to do is to get in contract with someone who can't close or gets rejected by the board and they have to start the whole process all over again. Or it can be the sublet policy. If you're buying as an investment to rent it out, well, in this case, the co-op with a strict sublet policy will not work for you. But if you're buying a primary residence, it can be to your advantage if they have a strict sublet policy, because first of all, you will not be competing with a professional investor, and most likely you're not going to see a new neighbor next door every year. Some of them can be loud, party all night, and cause inconveniences. Regarding the closing takes longer and the buildings aren't brand new buildings, well, that's why co-ops are more affordable than condos. You can wait another 30 days to close on your apartment, but your closing costs will be significantly cheaper and it will cost you less every month to carry your co-op apartment compared to a similar apartment in a condominium. Before we finish the video, one last thing that we need to talk about. What are some questions that you need to be asking when looking to buy a co-op apartment? Number one, are there any current assessments? The assessments are used to fund the capital improvements in a building. Generally, the buildings have financial reserves to handle the small improvements, but if there is a large expense, the board with the management company will negotiate multiple quotes, and when they agree to that specific improvement budget and timeline, the board will begin to fund the project. Each shareholder will pay according to the number of shares they own in the corporation for a certain period. Let's go back to our co-op building. As an example, let's say the building requires improvements in the lobby, hallways, and the boiler room. The board gets multiple quotes from different companies, and they agree to $48,000 quote. We have 8 apartments in this building and 3,200 shares. Let's say you own 600 shares, which is allocated to this 3-bedroom apartment. This comes out to be $15 per share project. Since you own 600 shares, you will be responsible to pay $9,000. And if the assessment period is 1 year, for this 3-bedroom apartment, this comes out to be $750 per month. During that year, every shareholder is responsible for their monthly maintenance plus their portion of the monthly assessment. In the situation when you're buying an apartment that has 2 months left for the assessment period, by the time you close, the assessment will be over. In some cases, you might look at the maintenance and think that it's great, you can afford it, but there's an expensive assessment that will go on for another 2 or 3 years. So you need to budget accordingly and be prepared. The assessments are necessary to not only maintain the building's proper condition, but depending on what kind of work has been done, it can also increase the value of your apartment. The apartment in the building that has a renovated luxury lobby can have a higher value than the same type of apartment in the buildings with a basic lobby. And the second question would be, is there a flip tax? It is basically a fee charged by the building for the transfer of a co-op apartment. It's usually anywhere between 1 to 3% of the purchase price or a specific dollar amount per share. Most of the time, if there's a flip tax in the building, the seller is responsible for paying it. But some buildings might require the buyer to pay the flip tax. If the seller pays that, just keep in mind that you will most likely need to pay that when you decide to sell later in the future. The whole point of this flip tax is to generate a revenue to help strengthen the building's financials. That's it for today's video. If you're looking to buy in New York City, hopefully you got some valuable information out of this. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.